Welcome to another episode of the 42 to Doomsday podcast. I'm Rob.
And I'm Mark.
And after the positive response to our interview with Aaron Challenger regarding his discovery and work on the immense collection of audio-visual material dating back to the early 1970s found in suburban Melbourne late in 2022, Mark and I were keen to speak with a person who took up the challenge of collating and including that collection into a series of university projects. To that end, we are delighted to have with us that very person, Professor Jason Bainbridge, the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra. A regular commentator on popular culture in the Australian media, Professor Bainbridge has also published widely on media culture, merchandising, licensing and popular representations of law. The Adelaide Festival of Ideas said in its bio of Professor Bainbridge that he occasionally finds his previous experience as a stand-up comedian very handy. Jason, welcome to the podcast. And has your sense of humour helped you cope with a massive task of collating this collection?
I think it has. Hello, Rob. Hello, Mark. Yes, I think the sheer volume of material means that you have to have a very good sense of humour, I think, to think that you're actually going to get through it in your lifetime. I think it's yeah.
When Aaron contacted you, did his word picture adequately describe the size of what you were about to take on board?
No, I don't think it did. I mean, he used words like vast and volume and massive. It wasn't enough to really convey the sheer number of tape and recordings that were part of the collection.
Now, we are a Doctor Who podcast, so we're going to torture you slightly with some questions about your introduction to the show before we move on to the real reason we've got you on.
Jason, tell us about your first Doctor Who experience, when you first became aware of the program and when you made that journey from casual watcher to a dedicated fan.
It was really because of my dad. My dad was a fan of the show. So as it is for a lot of Doctor Who fans, I think some of my earliest memories are of things like the Green Death and the Ark in Space and the Sea Devils coming out of the water, which I think is a classic one for a lot of people. So it really was that kind of tradition, just being part of the ABC with that regular nightly schedule. And it was something my dad and I would go and watch together. And that's really where it all started. And then, of course, you got the discovery that there's all these Target novelizations, and suddenly you can read about all of these episodes you'd never seen before. And then moving into things like when the Five Doctors were screened and stuff like that. So it's always been a part of my life that way, and it's always something I've kind of kept up with too. So I've dipped in and out of the Doctor Who magazine over the years, and certainly was incredibly excited with the revival, and have very fond kind of place-based memories of where I've seen Doctor Who too over the years. So it kind of becomes part of your personal history as well, I think, of thinking where you were when you saw the Chris Eccleston Doctor on screen, or when you finally got to see some of the Second Doctor kind of episodes you always heard about but had never seen because the ABC wouldn't replay them, and what was left of them. So I think from that point of view, it's always been a part of my life, and it's hard to think of life without Doctor Who in many respects.
Jason, in terms of what you currently do now, with your examination, I suppose, of popular culture, was Doctor Who that gateway to a vaster field of that sort of thing, or?
I think it was. It was a couple of reasons. A few people have said this over the years. I mean, Doctor Who is one of, if not the most, researched television shows that was ever made. I mean, there's just so much information you can find about the production of it, let alone, as a kid poring over the Doctor Who technical guide and all the kind of spin-off books that would give you all the details and the different types of Daleks and things like that. But particularly when you think of like the unfolding text and books like that, Doctor Who was one of those early examples of television being treated seriously, and maybe a little too seriously at times, but seriously by academics. So in that sense, it was a series that obviously I loved to watch, so it helped me develop a love of television particularly and media, but also it showed that there was this richer world of TV research out there, which is quite exciting. And over the years, particularly my teaching, Doctor Who's featured quite largely because it's also one of those common cultural touchstones for a lot of students. I mean, basically, when you've got something that's run that length of time, you can refer to it, and students in the class will have an awareness of Doctor Who, even if perhaps isn't a deep appreciation. And that's been something over the years. I remember talking about like discourses of the Daleks and likening Daleks to TV cameras and things like that, and the evolution of the Daleks being similar to the evolution of technologies. It's a great sort of common language with which to engage the students, because often their parents knew Doctor Who and they know an iteration of Doctor Who.
You don't make the students watch it in class?
No, not as much. Funnily enough, a few of the revival series, we have used discrete episodes of at times to highlight various concepts, but the older series, not as much.
Can you give us an example of some of those episodes you showed to the students to sort of explain some of those concepts you're talking about?
I'm going to disgrace myself by forgetting the names of a couple of them, but certainly a few of the Dalek episodes have been great. I mean, the Return of the Daleks in that Dalek episode was a great example, like of building tension and kind of ratcheting up that suspense. But there was that episode, which is the fans don't love that much, I know, but it was a good example of kind of media and media control, which was the one on station.
The Long Game.
Yes, the Long Game. We did use that a couple of times for examples, and I think that worked well because a lot of that, particularly the Russell T Davies kind of era of Doctor Who, really was reflecting on technology and media and change, and it was quite self-reflexive. And of course, you're always looking for interesting hooks to talk about media change and media power and media control. And, a Doctor Who example is often more lively than kind of talking about Rupert Murdoch. Perhaps slightly less horrifying, but more lively to engage the students, I think, in that way. So they were a couple of the modern episodes that we used, and even talking about like sat nav and stuff like that with the Sontaran stratagem and stuff like that. Yeah. There was a few good examples, and that kind of carried through the Stephen Moffat era too. But it was helpful to talk about media and technology in that way.
What is it, do you think, about Doctor Who that provides such fertile ground? Is it more capable of sustaining, a subject like what you've taught than say something like, I don't know, Babylon 5 or Star Trek or even something in the comics in Marvel or DC or any of the independent comics that are out there?
I mean, look, all science fiction, of course, reflects on the present day, but I think Doctor Who actually being set often, particularly in the revival series in contemporary London, was quite helpful for making the ordinary strange. In a weird way, almost a David Lynch type of way, but putting it through a science fiction filter. So making us think about broadcast technologies, for example. I mean, the science was bad, but that notion of the Daleks when they were in, was it New York in the 30s, I think it was, and they're actually able to broadcast their DNA. So that then gives you a springboard to talk about what is broadcasting, how does that work in that way, talking about, internet technologies and kind of evolution in that way. So I think it's that kind of relationship to the contemporary age that you don't get as much in Babylon 5 and Star Trek. It's all metaphor in Star Trek and Babylon 5 because it's set in a projected future, whereas Doctor Who, you're actually in the current age. So you've got the metaphorical layering of the alien or the monster of the week or things like that, but often it's speaking to something in a contemporary setting. And I mean, as you guys both know, I mean, that goes back to the Green Death and kind of, all sorts of monsters as metaphors in that way. And I think that's where Doctor Who has been kind of a pioneer, that later series like Buffy and that was celebrated for kind of using the monster as metaphor, but Doctor Who was doing it a lot earlier, and it makes it relevant, I think, to the students in that way. And I think the other thing we kind of almost miss now is just how much of an event Doctor Who was with that revival. I mean, it was just a massive, massive success. And I remember that kind of weekly iteration on the ABC. I was teaching in Tasmania at the time. And, there was that real excitement week to week of what was going to happen on Doctor Who, and that was shared amongst the students. It was shared amongst the staff. There was that real sense of a cultural moment, I think, with that revival of Doctor Who, which, despite the waxes and wanes in quality, I mean, one thing that Russell T Davies did so well, and I think it's exciting to see him come back, is that he made that really event television, and I'm hoping that we can see Doctor Who scale those heights again.
Of all the modern showrunners, Russell T Davies, the way he approached the series in his first run sort of provides that material that I'm sure you've utilised in teaching. Would that be right? I mean, he has that background. I mean, if you watch, say, The Second Coming, it's the effective, the return of Christ to modern day. I mean, and the modern series, his focus and concentration on people living ordinary lives in modern day London sort of seems to indicate that's an approach that is very popular with the viewing public.
Yeah, I mean, he made it relatable. I mean, he obviously talked about the kind of Buffy model as informing that too, but just the kind of clever production decisions he made, and as we know, some of them were were kind of forced, I think, behind the scenes by what rights the BBC had at the time. But I mean, not opening with the Daleks was just such a great idea because it built up the Doctor again as a character. Those nods to the past, with obviously bringing back Sarah Jane and K9 and things like that, but it never felt like fan service. It was a nod, and he was able to kind of maintain that balance between, providing the references to the past, but also then providing a new dimension on these characters for a current audience. I mean, excitingly, you can have fans that have never gone back further than the Christopher Eccleston era, but then you've got this generation of fans that go, oh, wow, there's this whole wealth of material I didn't know about. And I think that's the sign of a terrific revival and a really great showrunner, that you can maintain that interest week to week.
Before we move on to the material itself, just so that our listeners have a better sense of the sort of work and teaching that you do, tell us about media studies. Tell us about the sort of teaching that you've done. What's it all about?
I've always taught into media and communication and journalism to a degree as well, but my great passion and interest in research has been around pop culture and pop culture in comics and film and TV, and how that really can help us to think about the current world we live in. So it's treating pop culture seriously, I suppose. That's not taking the fun out of it or the pleasure out of it, but it's very much that kind of notion of pop culture holding a mirror up to our present culture and using that popular format to reach the largest audience that it can, to tell interesting stories about the current age that we're in. So that's really been the focus of my kind of academic journey, and across the way I've sort of taught and researched everything from the Beaconsfield mine disaster in Tasmania through to Pokemon and the sort of entrance of Pokemon Go in that climate, through to the incredible rise in superhero cinema. So superheroes moving out of comic books and into the kind of pinnacle of pop culture that they are at the moment. So it's been a very rewarding kind of journey to see that kind of appreciation for pop culture and what it can do, at the same time as having a lot of fun with it. And I think I very much ascribe to one of the academics in the field, Henry Jenkins, who talks about the notion of the ACA fan, so that academic who is also a fan, and how you balance that relationship. And they don't need to be mutually exclusive. You can be a fan of something. We'd say that kind of literary studies teachers are fans of Shakespeare, for example, but that doesn't stop you having that larger academic interest in terms of, what is this saying about the culture? What is this saying about where we are in our society at the moment? And I think that interest in pop culture, as you say, was very much driven from Doctor Who at an early age, but it's carried through all of those different iterations. So even now being a dean, I kind of still have a foot in the water of looking at what popular culture is telling us, and equally how we can help our creative producers, our artists, our filmmakers, our screenwriters, etc., to be the best they can be in the current funding environments.
What do you think that popular culture says about how people are today in the modern era? I mean, some people say we've come out of COVID and we've had economic shocks over the last 10 or 15 years. How do you think those real world impacts on people have impacted popular culture and people's embrace of it? Because, I mean, just from outside looking in, it seems like that popular culture has grown and grown and grown in the last 15, 20 years. And it's almost like a secular religion now. As observed religion falls away, yes, we've got people going in their tens of millions to see the latest, the Avenger movies, for instance, which are a huge cultural moment, I suppose.
Look, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, certainly, and we saw this particularly during the COVID years, and I know it sounds like I'm putting them in the past, and COVID is still very much with us, but I suppose the lockdown years, for want of a better term, I mean, we saw an incredible resurgence in nostalgia and people kind of looking at escapists. And I don't mean that in a kind of necessarily bad sense. Obviously, it was a very difficult time, but an escapist culture in terms of returning to those kind of cultural touchstones, which meant a lot to them, whether that was kind of, a 90s sitcom or Doctor Who. I mean, there was a great example, wasn't it, in England, of the Doctor Who kind of viewing parties and stuff like that that were happening during that time. So there's been an enormous resurgence in nostalgia for people, and that even tracks through to things like collectibles and eBay, where we've seen, the prices of nostalgic items sort of increase in value during that time as people have wanted perhaps to connect to a time which was better than what they're currently in, or to connect to a sense of stability and certainty that these franchises can provide. But I think that notion of escapism over the last few years has become incredibly influential in terms of what Hollywood is greenlighting now and things like that. I mean, the drop in interest in other forms of adult cinema, for example, in favour of blockbuster after blockbuster after blockbuster. And I love the Marvel films, I'll say that straight out, but it is a concern that push towards escapist popular cultural narratives is at such an extreme that it is hard to get some other films greenlit now and other series greenlit as well. So you kind of have an embarrassment of riches on the one hand, but then a lot of revivals, a great focus on franchises, on sequels, perhaps at the expense of original IP. And I think that's a shame. I think, one of the things that we can learn from popular culture is that we need that original IP to become the next thing. So I think, that's always been one of the great things with Doctor Who, is that each episode is kind of a new location, a new world, a new chance to engage with different people in a different setting. And obviously the Doctor Who spin-offs have led to that too. That we need more of that original IP as well, sort of filtering in. So I think there's the double-edged sword, if that kind of answers your question. I think people have been looking at that escapist or nostalgic kind of rush from popular culture, but that's meant the original IP has dried up in a lot of ways, and that's a real concern. I think the flip side too is that a lot of the people greenlighting popular culture now are of a similar age to us and probably some of your audience as well, that they have a great love for these old series and want to bring them back and want to sort of experience them in new ways. And I think that, again, that can be a double-edged sword. You've got a showrunner like Russell T Davies who can do that very well, whereas we've seen other revivals that perhaps haven't hit the mark quite as well because it's all been fan service or tried to update too much to a modern audience and lost along the way.
Yeah,
I'm interested in your thoughts on, just because we're an Australian podcast, we might as well talk about the Australian landscape in terms of film and television. Briefly, I suppose, where do you think the Australian film industry is at the moment, and maybe television as well? Because obviously, your point about the blockbuster after blockbuster sort of sucking the oxygen out of the industry, and smaller independent movies not really being able to see the light of day or have any, sustained success, I think really strikes home. So Australia is a small industry, I suppose, despite, the influx of American money to film over here and all that sort of thing. Where do you think the market is at the moment, the industry is at the moment?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's been a lot of discussions around that lately. I mean, one of the exceptions to that kind of blockbuster rule, of course, are smaller genre films, largely horror films, which have bucked all the trends. So, I mean, horror films still perform very well at the cinema. There's still a kind of shared experience of going out. They'll often be picked up by streaming channels as well. They're relatively cheap to make, and they can be, sort of the best example of independent film in terms of turning a profit at the moment. So the Australian cinema scene's always been an interesting one, because we've always sort of gravitated towards kind of the art house film, which tends not to have travelled that well, to be honest, because Australia obviously is an English-speaking country, so we can't really compete in a number of the international film awards that other countries can. But where we've had our biggest success has been with genre cinema, and I think in some ways, that's the future for us. I mean, you think of what was referred to as the 10BA cycle of Australian films, which was that tax cut that people got in the 80s that produced films like Razorback, like Mad Max, even like Crocodile Dundee. And it's those type of genre films that were quite small independent pictures that have travelled really well, and of course of George Miller and others. So that's one way I think the industry could go again. Sissy was a good example of that, a horror film that was produced in Australia recently that did quite well internationally as well, and actually was produced in Canberra, so I can speak to that being based in Canberra. But that was a good example of a genre film that way. The other option, of course, is the kind of Baz Luhrmann, is big blockbuster films, often with maybe an American lead or two, but using Australian crews. So, this is where Australia has benefited in the past from, providing kind of the background for the Matrix films or the Star Wars prequels or things like that. You lose that sense of Australianness, but you have quite a healthy industry because you're using Australian crews, Australian special effects. So there's a couple of ways we could go, but personally, and maybe I'm a bit biased too, being quite a fan of horror films, I think sort of the genre film would be a great way for the Australian cinema to go, and I think we can do that. And even if you call films like The Dry, the Eric Bana mystery film, the example of a genre film being a mystery-based film, I think that you have some great examples there, and that could travel really well and be quite healthy for the industry.
I recently picked up in the last few days from a charity shop a book published in the late 70s or very early 80s, based on some cinema paper articles that looks at the resurgence of the Australian film industry in the 70s. And I was just flicking through it, and you see, movies like Don's Party. It covers the different genres that, of the film industry. So Don's Party from 76 and Patrick and
yes,
and all those sort of things. So, a classic horror film from that particular era, Picnic at Hanging Rock. So there clearly was a golden age of sorts in the 70s, and one hopes that something similar is coming up or around the corner for Australia, or Australian cinema at least.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that kind of genre cinema can operate very well at the moment, because obviously it is such an uncertain time in cinemas in terms of streaming, in terms of what will bring audiences in, that, a lower cost film that's well produced, that has a good hook, and often the kind of genre film like Picnic at Hanging Rock, like Patrick, do have those very strong hooks to bring in an audience. They will perform well. So I think there's a real opportunity for Australia. It just depends on whether we get too hung up on trying to just produce one genre of film. And I think it's more exciting if we can have that diversity. And I think that diversity of genre films would be a great way to be competitive in that space. And certainly I know that the funding bodies in Australia are looking at different ways of funding films along that way too.
Because even in the 90s, there's some great films like Muriel's Wedding and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert as well. So when we do hits, we do them really well, and they do export extremely well. So those smaller ones unfortunately just don't get that visibility, and especially when they're being swarmed by, seems to at the moment, back-to-back, wall-to-wall superhero films.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other avenue for Australian films too is in streaming. I mean, that's where we've seen some good pre-sales that help the production of films, that they kind of sell the streaming rights quite early on. And that's where you're getting multiple channels and more people actually, looking at the product. So I think that does allow for some smaller films, because arguably that's where a lot of the more adult cinema in terms of dramas and non-superhero, non-genre films are going, is streaming. So I do think there's a good aspect in terms of streaming for Australian films too, internationally, and that's where being English language, I think, helps us in some ways too, to get onto those larger streaming services. But certainly we've seen some successes lately with Amazon and Stan locally, obviously, and Netflix as well, of people selling content on there, and that helps. I mean, that's the other interesting thing, of course, is whether we're talking about film as in cinema anymore, or whether it is actually in the kind of streaming space. So lots of opportunities, but yes, it's an interesting time. And I think, look, if we were having this discussion in LA, there'd be similar discussions there around, what's happening with these TV shows that are commissioned, and we film a season and then they're dropped and never aired to get the tax break. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things happening at the moment as people trying to navigate this new environment. So it's not just Australia that's struggling to find its place with the new technologies.
And maybe the days of the blockbuster instantly recouping money are gone, because you look at the Shazam that's come out, that's sort of, they're saying it's bombed, and the Ant-Man film, maybe they're more slow burners in terms of recouping the money now, because people just go, I'll just wait for streaming.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, it's also too early to tell how much people have got used to that during the COVID era as well. So much was made available online. It is that kind of reluctance. I mean, certainly we've seen that anecdotally. I don't think there's firm evidence yet, but we've seen it anecdotally with Disney Animation, for example, that Disney Animation has not performed as well theatrically since COVID, because people got used to seeing, Disney Animation on a streaming service. And in fact, when you've got very high quality animation like, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio on Netflix and stuff like that is made for streaming, I think that throws certain genres into question of how they'll perform at the cinema. And certainly, there's a lot of blockbuster films now. So, some of them like Shazam, aren't going to do well. And there's that kind of feeling that if it hasn't made it on the weekend, it's not going to make it. But I think you're right. Over time, when it comes to the streaming services, we'll see that revenue build and things like that. Although I must say I had no interest in Shazam 2. I like Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu, but it just looked odd with them walking around with big staves, waving at things, and CGI dragons popping up. So I've got to say I wasn't front row for that when it came out.
No, I think there's a bit of superhero film fatigue at the moment, no matter how they spin it. I think it's, as you said, I think people are looking for different sort of IP at the moment, and I'm looking forward to see John Wick 4 this week, so there you go. Bit of mindless violence as opposed to people flying around in capes.
Let's move on to this big collection that's been found. I mean, the great hope, I suppose, from a lot of people who were listening at the time in their comments on various forums, and thank you everyone for your comments as well, is that it contains missing material. Now, that's all predicated on a culture in Australia and obviously in Britain of not retaining this material at that time. So, Jason, as someone who has a deep interest in popular culture and media, what do you make? I mean, some would call what the BBC, what ITV, what even the commercial networks and even the ABC here in Australia have done a form of cultural vandalism. What do you make of the whole missing episode field industry? What do you think?
Well, look, there's a few things to say on this. So yes, I mean, obviously, as a media academic, particularly someone who values media history and actually having access to those original recordings, it is a form of cultural vandalism from our perspective. But I think at the time, television was seen as a disposable product. I mean, it wasn't meant to be. Certainly, the idea of even videotape or DVDs or actually making a profit from actually commercializing content and selling it in a packaged format was that far beyond what the BBC or the ABC or any other networks would have had at the time, that there was just no conception of the value of what was being lost. And of course, if you were to talk to people in the archives of these institutions at the time, they'd say, well, we were doing the right thing. We were trying to hang on to these news reports or, this recording of this sporting event and things like that, because that was how they valued culture at the time. It comes back to my earlier point that not the popular culture was necessarily devalued, but it wasn't seen to be as important as the big cultural events. And of course, the great irony is those big cultural events are preserved in any number of ways, not just through kind of television recordings, whereas an episode of Doctor Who only existed as an episode of TV. Therefore, if you don't keep that, it's very hard to maintain it. So I think from our position, of course, it's very much a form of cultural vandalism, and you can only think of the loss and the lost shows we have, that just haven't been retained. But I think from the perspective of the time, they probably thought they were doing the right thing, and it comes down to whether you can judge someone another age by your standards. So as much as I'd love to have complete runs of Doctor Who and Adam Adamant and all sorts of British telefantasy series particularly, the reality is we don't. And people at the time would have thought they were doing the right thing. That said, I think the exciting thing is that it really points to the origins of fan culture, when you've got these dedicated fans who are recording things off air, and that's what we have in place of the kind of original telecast in some cases. That to me is also exciting in its own way, to think that level of fandom was there, that embrace of new technology as it was at the time was there, and that's what we have. So it's a double-edged sword. It's probably not the straightforward answer you were hoping for, but I think, of course it feels like cultural vandalism to us, but at the time, television was disposable. Pop culture was particularly disposable. The people making those decisions thought they were making the right call, and obviously we'd all be howling them down now and saying no if we were there. That's where we find ourselves.
It's interesting though, because like Doctor Who, we obviously don't have a complete run, where Star Trek you do. And to me and a number of people find it much more interesting that, I know it's awful that they don't exist, But the fact that they don't exist actually gives us more interest in it. You know what I mean? And there's always like, oh, what if it'd be great if it came back? Oh, we've got this material. Did it actually look like this, or was it something else? So there's always guessing games in terms of what that material was like on its transmission, as opposed to Star Trek, where you've got it all on tap. And that's actually more disposable, really, than Doctor Who was back then, and other telefantasy shows as well. Because you're not taking notice of it.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I mean, part of the great attraction, I think, at least for me as a fan of Doctor Who, and I'm sure for, talking to other fans, it's a common thing, is that notion of this enormous scope that Doctor Who has. Whether that the episodes do exist, but you just haven't seen them at that point when they're on TV. And then, of course, now with the DVD runs and things, you've got more of an opportunity, and even the reconstructed stories. But that idea there's always something more of Doctor Who out there to discover and explore, I think, is a big attraction to it. And I mean, I remember, devouring the Target novelizations of the Dalek Master Plan, and just trying to imagine, that particularly those alien delegates gathered together with the Daleks. Now, I'm sure the BBC budget is nowhere near my imagination, but that kind of, really interested me and sustained me. And I mean, the joy of kind of discovering Patrick Troughton as the Doctor, and how wonderful like the episodes we have of his are, and the reconstructions even are, was a revelation to me. I mean, Patrick Troughton, I was kind of like just another Doctor to me. He certainly wasn't up there with John Pertwee and Tom Baker, but actually being able to discover that, and that's, I think, part of it. You're right. Part of the excitement with Doctor Who is that there's always that next discovery, and the fact that some of it doesn't exist, but may be out there, is even more exciting. It's kind of going back to Russell T Davies as the showrunner, kind of creating these moments of excitement week to week. I mean, it's almost part of Doctor Who's history and future, isn't it? That we might discover another episode here, and suddenly there'll be a great revival of the Macra Terror again, or we'll be rediscovering these old classics. So I think that's part of the excitement with Doctor Who. You're right, in a perverse way. That's what interests people.
The material that you've taken custody of, Jason, what about it, or the prospects that it offered to you, interested you? I mean, why take on, a truckload, literally, I suppose, of audio-visual material dating back, I suppose, to the early to mid-1970s up until today?
Well, it's interesting probably on three folds. I mean, part of it is that media history is really important, and it's something that clearly we have the National Film and Sound Archive in Australia, which does a good job of preserving that material. But accessibility to the material is still relatively hard in many cases. So it's a wonderful opportunity, particularly for our students, and we'll talk more about the projects later on, but for our students to be immersed in that kind of media history. So whenever you see that there's a massive collection of tapes, and certainly nothing on the scale of this that I've seen previously, but a massive collection of tapes, you're always interested, because you think, well, what is in there that hasn't been kept? Because it's the ephemeral stuff that is the most valuable. The second part then, I think, comes into more this discussion where you start to think, well, that period of time was interesting for Australian TV. There's a lot of interesting American content and British content that's on there. Of course, being a Doctor Who fan, you think, well, maybe there might be something there, or even there could be interesting episodes of Countdown that people haven't seen, or other examples, because, again, Australian TV has not been as valued in many respects, despite the good works of the National Film and Sound Archive. So I think there's that possibility. And then the third one, really, at the end of the day, is if it turns out that everything we knew about this collector and their collection is wrong, and they actually were an avid AFL fan, and we just have hours and hours of AFL games, even if that's all we had, we would still have the advertisements. And that is a great source of value in and of itself, because advertising tells you so much about a culture and about a period in time. So there's kind of a triple value in this for me, that a diminishing series of returns. I think if it's all AFL, I'm going to be very disappointed. But I'm sure I wouldn't be alone in that. But I think that there's that possibility of it being incredibly rich. But even if it turns out not to be that substantively exciting, you've still got the ads, you've still got potentially the voiceovers, the bumpers, all these sorts of things. And that's the ephemeral stuff, which is lost, and that's exciting to see what's on there.
Potentially news reports of the day as well.
Yeah. So you'll get that kind of breaking news, the news updates, all these sorts of things. So yes, that's where the value is. It's kind of, when we talk about television studies, we used to talk about the flow of TV before streaming, that notion of the TV programmer that would decide that, this moment of TV flowing to the next was a great way to get your audience together for the night. And that's a concept we don't have as much, because everyone's sort of become their own program director now, and that they can go from watching something on Netflix to something on ABC to something on free to air to, going off to Amazon Prime or whatever else, and then they can put in their DVD, and that's how they have a night's viewing. They're no longer dependent on what they're given. But that notion of flow is still really interesting and really important, because it does kind of point to how a culture responded to TV and what they valued as important at the time. So that's an exciting concept for students too, that have grown up in an era where it was purely what they did, what they chose to do. It's interesting to think of TV as something received as well. That was something which was predetermined for them. So that's kind of educational in a positive sense as well, that they can sort of experience TV as many of us experienced it during that kind of broadcast era.
And it was more dog eat dog back then in terms of that scheduling, wasn't it? Where you had our commercial stations where, as you said, their hours of power, as it were, lined up against each other. Yes. To see who would become dominant, and they'd purposely hold back shows, 6 months of America and have them starting in February over. It just, you think about it now, that wasn't that long ago. It's completely shifted into this, as you said, do-it-yourself scheduling.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly Australian networks were quite fascinating, because they often had relationships with the American broadcast industry. So Channel 9 obviously had a long-standing relationship with Warner Brothers, Channel 7 with Disney, Channel 10, they revived their fortunes because they had a relationship with the Fox network when it first started. And it really became this kind of TV in Australia, or Australia rather, was described as one of the best places to watch TV in the world back in the 90s, because we got everything. So we got the HBO shows of a night. You could watch Sopranos and Sex and the City and all these things late at night. I mean, the great rumour over the years is that Kerry Packer was a big science fiction fan. That's why you got the kind of late night scheduling of the Star Trek series and Buffy and things like that, counter programming that then on 7. So we always had a wide range of TV. The TV schedulers in those years were gods, because they very much made the determination on what would keep someone with Channel 9 or with Channel 10 for the night. And their whole careers depended on getting that alignment right. And in the case of Channel 10, I mean, we talk about Channel 10 now being in potentially entering receivership and in trouble again. And Channel 10's always been that network over the years. But that was very much the case in the 90s, where it looked like Channel 10 would disappear and essentially become a movie-only network. And it was their purchase of some Fox programs, untested Fox programs, The Simpsons, The X-Files, and they got Seinfeld in a trade with Channel 9 that really, saved them. So, I mean, it was 3 American shows which turned that whole network around. So it was a very different time. And as you say, not that long ago. I mean, we're talking about probably the early 2000s before things started to radically change in that space.
Let's talk about practicalities, I suppose, for a moment. I mean, how will the utilisation of this material be integrated into the projects at the University of Canberra, Jason? I mean, who's going to be examining the tapes? What methods are they using? I mean, how are they going to be using it? Do you have players? Because some of this material is, older than me, and that's ancient, basically. I mean, and how long do you think it'll take to work through this fabled truckload of material?
With the actual recorded material, we got some players with it, some of which are working. And there's been a few people reaching out to me and the university sort of asking, well, when is this sort of kicking off these projects? I'd love to be part of it and all this sort of stuff. And part of it has been doing a bit of an audit of what we actually need and what we have to play the material. So we're in the process of wrapping that up now, with the view that we'll start to launch projects through our website, the University of Canberra website, from about the middle of this year. So that's really what we've been doing, because you're right, there's an incredible volume of material and variety of material that requires different playing systems. So we've been seeing what works in what we've got there, what we need to get in, and equally how we set this up, because obviously it's going to be a long-term project, let me put it that way, or a series of projects to get through the material. So that's been the big first step, has been actually auditing the equipment needed and making sure we've got that. And again, we're fortunate that in Canberra we're close to the National Film and Sound Archive, and potentially would have access to their equipment. We haven't had to rely on that yet, but it's nice to know that that's there too. And so we'll be reaching out to our colleagues there at some stage to sort of look at what we're doing in this space. In terms of working through the material, I mean, that's one of the reasons why having it as a university collection makes sense. It is a vast, vast collection of material that will take, years really to get through in many respects. And this is why it lends itself to a variety of staff and student projects, because simply going through that many hours of recordings, not knowing exactly what it is you're going to stumble across means that you need a lot of eyes on this, working through it. And that's where, as I say, it's possible that certainly for our students, it's an opportunity to engage in a form of media research that they may not be used to, but is still highly valued, which is actually going through media content, identifying what's there, and then drawing some conclusions from it. So our early projects we're proposing from about the middle of the year will be probably more at the honours levels. They're year-long projects, which would be basically media literacy and media content analysis, going through a selection of tapes, and we'll try and kind of gather those together as much as we can into the groupings from the indications we have, which range from some detailed notes on some of the tapes through to very little on a lot of others, into some sort of array. And then the students will work through those tapes and kind of start to talk about what it is they're seeing, that relationship to culture. So the idea will be that there'll probably be the best part of 6 months of kind of analysis of what's on the tapes, which will also provide us with a guide to what's there. And then that will be followed up by kind of an exploration of how that connects to the culture of the time and what that means. So they'll have a complete project over the course of that year, and we'll also start to have a catalogue of the material that's actually on these tapes emerging during that time. Students will have some training in how to do that media analysis too, what to look out for in terms of dates and indications of time and period, as well as having a bit of a list of things to keep an eye out for, to be honest. So
you want to make sure those kids aren't got the label Doctor Who rubbish and then throwing it in the bin. You want some, like we've been there before. We just need some sort of supervisory eyes on this to make sure that nothing's been overlooked.
I'm just interested, does the fact that this material exists and is in the hands of the University of Canberra, did that open up opportunities for this sort of coursework? Or even if you hadn't had this material, would you still been able to do the same sort of coursework but with, different, perhaps more modern material?
It would be different and be more modern material, and that's where I think the fact that it is removed from the students by decades, by many decades, makes it more interesting in terms of a process. Because, I mean, as I said, the modern era of TV is so different to these timeframes, so going up really to the early 2000s. And I think it's an opportunity for students to understand more around programming and flow and the cultural ideas of the time. I think, yes, we can do this type of analysis with modern television, but it's not really as rich in that way, because it's kind of that almost that process of estrangement where they're taken out of the location and the time zone that they're comfortable in and presented with something quite different. That's what makes it rich, and also encourages that research and reflection, because they are then researching a different period of time as well. So in answer to your question, yes, we could do those types of projects, but not at this scale. And secondly, I think it opens itself up to longer term projects. So as I say, we'll launch with the honours sort of ones because they're relatively simple to open up. And then we'll look at exploring masters and PhD level ones as well as we start to work through the material. And it is worthwhile noting that part of this kind of 6 months setup, which ultimately it'll be before we actually launch this and open it up to students and the broader public if there is that interest there. Basically we'll be producing checklists of things to keep an eye out for as well. And we have a range of cultural historians at the University of Canberra and digital archivists as well as Doctor Who fans who are part of this sort of staffing group too, that will be able to provide information around that. So there will be very clear briefing packs for all our students going into this. It's more to make sure that, as I'm sure your listeners will appreciate as well, the students have a project out of this as well. So if it does turn out that they're not the student that finds the missing episode of Doctor Who in this particular way, or Countdown or something else, that they still have a valuable project in and of itself.
Would you say that this material is unique within the media space, in terms of education in Australia? I mean, has the University of Canberra got a leg up on all the other, universities in Australia that deal in similar courses? I mean, it sounds like you've got a really rich and vibrant, look into the past that perhaps other universities may not have.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these kind of archives are incredibly rich when you find them, and certainly I've never encountered an audio-visual archive like this. Our colleagues at the National Film and Sound Archive have said something similar, that this is an incredible volume of material that they really haven't seen this scale either. And I mean, that they should know out of everybody. So yes, I think it's an incredible body of work for the students and staff that is relatively unique. I mean, to find someone, a collection like this by someone who has been so dedicated to recording so much interesting material, or what looks like interesting material, certainly in the Australian context, is incredibly rare. And I haven't encountered another collection like this, and I'm unaware of colleagues that have either. So obviously it was tremendously exciting for us, and just such a great kind of bringing together of the university's strengths in kind of cultural history, in media and comms, and with that connection to the National Film and Sound Archive as well. So I just want to also reassure your listeners that, I mean, we very much appreciate the privilege that we have in having this material, and we'll treat it with the respect that it's very much deserves to go through it carefully. So we're very much aware of what treasures could be there. But as I said, even without that kind of treasure, it's an incredible view into the past and into Australian culture and history, and that is unique in the academic environment.
Obviously, the focus, I suppose, is on the coursework, the honours portion of someone's course. But I mean, you mentioned the National Sound and Film and Sound Archive. As you and your students work through this material, and as they catalogue it and record it and so forth, how do you intend to share your findings to the broader community, even if that broader community is a couple of hundred, quote unquote nerds who are interested in this sort of thing outside the university space itself?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about that, because obviously, as I say, we've mentioned this so many times during this interview, but I mean, the volume of material is so large that it will take a long time to get through it. So part of the project too is to generate interest in the project, because we really want to see more students and as I said, opening up other project opportunities even for the general public to be part of this. So part of that generation of interest is sharing what we find, and we've already talked about some social media channels and that can highlight some of what we discover. And obviously we'll have to respect IP and copyright that people have in some of this material, but equally we can rebroadcast some of this for academic purposes, and particularly some of those sort of interesting, unique elements will be doing that, and we'll be providing kind of a running update. And again, we've talked about different ways to do this, of what we find. So my hope would be that catalogue of material will become public as we kind of release it, so people will know what's in there actually, and what is valuable, and what we've discovered. And it could be in the case of a recording of Star Trek, for example, it could be some of the ads that ran during that time, or the voiceovers that happen, or the bumpers between the ad breaks, and seeing what they look like in that kind of Australian context. So certainly it's important to us that we share what's on here, partly to share it to educate the audience of what's out there as part of that notion of of opening people up to that notion of cultural history, partly because it generates interest in the project. And, the more eyes, the more people we have, the faster we will move through this material as well and actually discover what's there. And then thirdly, because I think there have been questions in the past about accessibility to some media materials. So it's a wonderful opportunity to do that as well and make that catalogue public and let people know that this will become a resource that people can access and use once we know what's on it. And so that's kind of the exciting second step with this, is that we will have this incredible archive of material that will be accessible to people.
Your main conduit to the community in terms of what your students find would be through the website, I think you mentioned before. Is that correct?
Yes. So we'll have obviously the University of Canberra website, and we can create websites off the back of that, and also social media channels would be what we'd be doing in that space. But we have been looking at, obviously we will advertise the projects through the main University of Canberra site, but as students and staff take up those projects and start to work through the material, we'll start to provide those materials through our social media channels. And then, if the demand is there, which I'm certainly hoping it is, then we'll actually have a kind of separate website that would be part of the University of Canberra, but would be devoted to this project and would be publicising the catalogue as we start to build that, but also some of the clips and material we've found.
People who listened to our previous episode on this would have heard with increasing horror the large volume of material that was actually thrown out before Aaron was able to basically stop that. But even so, I mean, there is a lot. You've used the words vast amount of material that's come up to Canberra. I mean, in your initial examinations of what you got, can you put a figure on the number of individual units, tapes, reels that you've got? I mean, are we talking? It's clearly more than hundreds. Is it into the thousands? It's
yes,
much bigger than the thousands.
It would be well into the thousands. Yes. And these are long recording tapes. I mean, there are hours per each tape, so there are thousands of hours of material. Yep. I mean, it is vast, and I certainly appreciate that, and happy to take people up and see what we can do. But I mean, I know there are people, members of the public, that have reached out, so I'm happy to help. Yes, and that's right, but people will be working on portions of this collection because it is so vast, and certainly it's tragic to think of what might have been lost, but in the discussions I've had with Aaron as well, you need to focus on what's there.
Exactly.
And there's going to be a wonderful array of material there, and that's what we're kind of focused on at the moment. But yes, it is thousands of hours basically is what we're talking about. So this will be a multi-year ongoing project, and that's why we want to build that interest in it. We want people to be engaged, and certainly we're open to people being part of the collection, visiting scholars and all sorts of things, people engaging in that way. But it's important for everyone to understand this isn't something that, even if people were putting 18 hours a day in going through it, it's still going to take a very long time to get through this material. And the actual cataloguing itself of the material is variable, let's put it that way. So some tapes are marked. I've got no idea yet if because I've been through all of even those, if that actually matches the contents of the tape. But there are hundreds to thousands that aren't. So there's a lot of material here which we don't even know what it is until students and staff start to work through it. So that's what the kind of challenge is, and the excitement.
So you mentioned, Jason, that the students will be obviously going through the tapes and the general public as well. Will they be digitising this content as they're watching it? And you probably haven't thought that far in advance yet in terms of what's going to happen to it, but potentially when you're finished in 2033, going through it all, what will happen to those tapes? Will they sort of stay there, or will they be handed back to the NSA for safekeeping?
I mean, they are an archive now that's part of the university. So, again, to reassure everyone, when a university takes on a collection like that, it becomes part of the university collection. And similar to a number of museum collections, while it may not be visible all the time, it is always retained. They are now part of the university archive. And again, that's why we've taken this period of months to make sure everything is looked after and inputted into the university archive records that way. In terms of digitising content, it's a good question. I certainly welcome some thoughts on it. We've taken the view of working through the tapes in the first instance. seeing what's on them, and then I suppose making some decisions around how much we digitise, how much we don't digitise. Again, it's a question of volume, but that certainly would be a stage of the project. But it kind of for the next, and you put the 2033 date on it, you may not be wrong. It's for the next few years at least. It will be around providing that catalogue of actually what's on there and going from there. And certainly very happy to collaborate with the National Film and Sound Archive and look at what we can do in terms of that material. But equally, my hope would be that the university would be able to provide some accessibility to those materials too in different ways, in forms of screenings, etc., to open that up, and also provide accessibility to the public, as I say, through social media channels and other options there. So it will be retained in those forms, but the actual archive itself is in itself of value. The fact that someone, the collector that sort of put all this together, has actually gone to the trouble of putting it onto these tapes in this format is valuable. And it's important, again, to go back to that notion of media history, that we're interested in what's on the tapes, but our cultural historians are interested in the tapes and in the recording equipment and in that itself. So the collection is not just valued for what's on the tapes, it's valued for the fact that this actually exists in this format.
That's really fascinating that there's that a collection of physical objects in and of themselves have value, I suppose, cultural value or historical value.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's been some fantastic projects. A colleague of mine at the University of Canberra did a wonderful project looking at how scientific collections were kept in an assortment of boxes, everything from twisty boxes to something else. And those boxes themselves that housed the collection were interesting because of the choices that were made and the kind of cultural kind of geography that they provided of various things at the time. So yes, the physical materials themselves are incredibly interesting to us. The way that the choices that were made around the way that some things were itemised and some weren't, that's all interesting in and of itself. So it's important, it's just to recognise that archive is as much about the materials themselves as actually what's recorded on them.
I think another fascinating thing with Jason will be observing what their reactions are while watching this material as they're going through the tapes. They smile or they just have their head in their hand going, oh my God, I can't believe they transmit, Love Thy Neighbour in the 70s. That'd be really fascinating reaction to get from them in terms of what their observations were, what their thoughts were of television at the time in the context of how they consume media today.
Yeah, and it comes back to that earlier question of, yes, we could have done a project like this with current media, but it is so much more interesting to have the students confronted in that sense, or reflective on the fact that cigarette advertising was part of growing up in Australia in the 70s through the 80s. It was a big part, and they were beautiful ads, and then thinking about the way that was constructed. I mean, ideas in relation to race, to gender, to sexuality, and how they've changed over time as well. So that's what's going to be, I think, a source of real interest, is those connections. And then I think there are the students that maybe are like ourselves. I mean, I often talk about the fact that I never saw an episode of Patrick McGowan's The Prisoner or the horror soap opera Dark Shadows for years, but I'd read about them in books. I'd seen sort of photos, you read about them in Epilogue magazine, stuff like that. So I'm also hoping that it will inspire students' interest in some past media forms as well, that they'll connect to series they wouldn't have otherwise been interested in that kind of way. So I think that's quite exciting too, that you are actually sparking an interest in some of those older media forms that, for whatever reason, have kind of fallen away or fallen out of favour. So it's that kind of being confronted with a different age and a different time. And I think that's really, really exciting. I mean, we know the students, still get a kick out of someone using an old telephone or different fashions and things like that. So
vinyl records these days, isn't
exactly.
it? I'm hip now, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that, there's going to be great interest for students working through that. And of course, I've mentioned a couple of times too that there will be staff, including myself, who will be looking at portions of the collection too, because obviously there's going to be a wealth of material there that we're keen to explore too. And it's important to know that because of the size of the collection, we'll be working through in portions, because that's as much as any person can do, but we'll be providing those kind of guidelines for everyone engaging with the collection of what to look out for. I've talked a lot about cultural value in different forms, but obviously the possibility of lost episodes is front and centre in what we're doing.
And on that score, Jason, what are the protocols in place if you discover and your students discover missing material, whether it be Australian, the UK? Do you have anything in place in terms of you've discovered an episode of Adam Adamant, for instance? They know that they've discovered an episode of Adam Adamant. How does that get propagated up the chain to, say, the actual original copyright holder?
Jason, you got to call Rob and myself first?
That's right, yeah. So obviously after I've spoken to you and we've all watched it together and there's a lot of whooping cheers and everything else, then yes, I mean, obviously for Australian content, we are fortunate to have the National Film and Sound Archive close by, so we've got a good second pair of eyes around that who can also put us in touch with copyright holders. And of course, for some content, that's quite hard. That's why I hope I'm not sounding evasive when I talk about making that content available online, but obviously we have to navigate some of the copyright holders that do still exist and in some cases may not even be traceable. So we've got a good sort of sense check for us with the Australian ones. With the kind of English and American content, then obviously we've got a few connections and media bodies that we can go to there with that. I mean, it's fair to say that, you know, everyone will hear about it relatively quickly. There'll be no hiding anything away. I think it'll be a great moment. I think the interesting thing will be if something is found, who finds it? And you could have the interesting situation where a student in their 20s who's never been the most devoted Doctor Who fan in the world suddenly front page news because they've discovered a missing episode, but that's just part of it. But yes, we are putting protocols in place. And again, that I hope explains to people why, you know, it has taken a while since the delivery of the collection to actually making it available for projects. We just wanted to get all of that in place before opening it up in that way.
Jason, that's very comforting that you've got those protocols in place for the future. I'm sure we'll all be listening and even viewing the website with keen interest come the time that it goes live. On behalf of Mark and myself, I'd very much like to thank you for coming on to the episode. It's really fascinating to hear the sort of work that you do and how this collection will help inform it and your students for many years to come. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you both. And I mean, you know, yes, very, very happy to keep everyone looped in. And also, as I say, if people want to reach out to find out how they might be part of the projects and things like that, very happy to have those discussions too. So it's an exciting time and a great collection. So thank you both for having me on.
You've just listened to another episode of 42 to Doomsday, the podcast that loves talking about Doctor Who. We'd love to hear from our listeners. Please drop us a line at 42todoomsday@gmail.com. We can be reached at facebook.com/42 to Doomsday. If brevity is your game, we can be found on Twitter at 42 to Doomsday. Please check out our blog, 42todoomsday.wordpress.com, where Mark and I occasionally have something interesting to say. Aside from iTunes, you can listen to us via Stitcher and Player FM. If you enjoyed listening to us, leave a review on iTunes. As always, thank you for listening. Have a great week. We'll speak with you again soon.